Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Right now, the IZA is holding its annual conference on labor market institutions run by Pierre Cahuc and Costas Tatsaramos. And Stan Hammermesh, I'm spending a bit of the morning talking to three participants at the conference who have very interesting papers. The first is Daniele Checchi of the Università di Milano. Second is Moritz Drechsel-Grau of Universität Zurich, right?
Well, it's now Munich.
Oh, you're at Munich.
I just switched like a week ago. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't keep up with that.
That was my bad. I should have changed.
That's okay. And finally, Andrea Bassanini, who is at the OECD, lucky him, in Paris. Okay, in the beautiful 16th arrondissement, as I remember. Anyway, gentlemen, let me start off by asking each of you a question about your work. The first is Daniele. And you talk about the correlation between hours and hourly wage rates, which is probably the most essential correlation in labor economics, since that's the reduced form of supply and demand. It's had been negative, and now it's zero, even positive. What does this mean? I mean, does it just simply mean that supply is now more important than demand? And more important, what does that imply about income inequality, which is one of the essential things we study? Tell me the answer.
Simple textbook teaches us that women elasticity is positive and men elasticity is almost nil. So one could think about a compositional change in the labor market. In our contribution, we study the relevance of this transition of correlation between hours and wages, which was at least negative for a couple of countries, France and Germany, and then becomes positive. Actually, the problem is not that simple. It is an increasing participation of women, but this is not enough to explain what we are observing. Women elasticity have become more and more positive. And the problem is that there is an increasing polarization in the labor market. Those who were making more money in France and Germany at the beginning of the 60s were working less. Now they're working more hours. And that transition is what one should be focusing on, because polarization in hours induce an additional means of inequality increasing, which is related to labor market flexibilization, at least for Germany. In the case of Germany, there is a recent paper by Schroeder and a co-author where they show that the involuntary unemployed people is increasingly at the bottom of the distribution.
Okay, I see that. So what you're saying basically is all of this underlies the rising inequality in labor markets. So people like me who make a high wage and work very hard are making things worse in terms of inequality. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. If I can show you a slide.
Yeah, a quick slide would be okay, sure.
Which is taken from the annual report of the Social Security. This is a growth incidence curve by centile in the distribution of earnings from the labor market, measured over a period which is between 2005 and 2020. As you see, these are real incomes. As you see, most and is related to Italy, but as you see, something like 3/4 of the earnings distribution got a negative annual increase, which implies that the people are working less and less hours, at least at the bottom of the distribution, and because they are earning so little, because of the reduction of working hours, including the non-increase in their wage, these imply an increasing distance between the core of the distribution, where permanent and stable workers still are able to protect their income, and an increasing body of working poors.
Okay, good. Let me go on then. Thank you. I mean, this is very depressing to me. I mean, the question is what's going to happen in the future. Maybe it'll all turn around now. Moritz, let me ask you a question about your work. I mean, I've studied the minimum wage now, my own research off and on for 40 some years. And at this point, I find minimum wage research on the employment level to be utterly boring. So I was very pleased to see you doing something else. How high should the minimum wage be?
So I can't keep up with the 40-something years studying the minimum wage, but let's see if I can tell you something that's a bit.
But your work won't be as boring as most of the stuff.
Maybe I hope so. So I mean, you alluded to the fact that mostly we think about employment responses, but I think we can use the minimum wage not only to, let's say, increase earnings without shooting up the unemployment rate, but also to affect the composition of jobs, right? Because it's kind of like, use it as a productivity whip. If you have frictional labor markets, there's all sorts of low productivity jobs around. And if you have this kind of crude tool like a minimum wage, then the more productive firms can afford that more easily than the low productivity firms. And it's going to create some asymmetry and push the low productivity firms out. So that we want to kind of leverage that effect. And I mean, past research has shown that you can go up to 50, 60% without lowering employment. Now, what I find in my model, where I have both like these employment effects, but also look at the composition of jobs, is that you can push the minimum wage up to, let's say, 65 to 70% without driving up unemployment in the long run. And then you improve the composition of jobs along the way. You kind of have almost a zero effect on unemployment or employment, but you have better jobs in the end. And so I would say you shoot for 70%. I mean, lots of countries are shooting for 2/3, which is, I mean, it's quite close, but do it gradually and kind of inch closer to the point where at some point we're going to fail, where the adverse effects of minimum wages start to dominate, right? So I think that's important.
As I remember, the SMIC in France is about of the average wage. Certainly, is that about right, Andrea?
60% of the median.
Yeah.
As I remember, it's indexed also, whereas in the US, forget about the federal minimum, which is for all intents and purposes zero. But most states have their own. But even in the states which have their own minimums, I mean, we're not even 50% in the US in those states, and much less nationally. But maybe it's different in Germany or France than in the US. Maybe the optimal minimum, even in terms of the margins you're talking about, forcing out weak firms. How might that differ across economies like the US, which is very flexible, and Germany, which is much less so?
I mean, it's true that it's very flexible, but I mean, in the end, it comes down to whether you have this kind of misallocation in the labor market. Given that in the US, you have you have very, very little social security system for low income folks. So they kind of might be forced to take low earnings jobs and take them up. So there's still room for these low productivity firms to hang around and hire people because they need to, right? So I think in that sense, it's not so much different. I think the countries that are different in terms of the labor market are more the Scandinavian countries, where you have collective bargaining that's quite strong. And the crucial thing is here that they bargain wages. I mean, it's more flexible than a federal minimum wage, but they bargain them, and then all firms have to cooperate. So, and in Germany, but also in the US, like if you're a low productivity firm, you can set your own wage. That doesn't quite work in Scandinavia. So they have kind of like a, let's say, privately negotiated, flexible minimum wage scheme, right? But then it's essentially does the same thing for you, right? And they wouldn't need one, right?
They don't need a minimum because it's all taken care of by
exactly. But in that sense, I would say the US is more similar to other countries in Europe, where collective bargaining is on the decline, and it's kind of there's lots of low-skilled workers with very little bargaining power.
Okay, it's the first time I've ever heard the US labor market analogized to much of Europe.
What I think where you're right is that I think these transitions can be much faster. Like in
the US,
if you hike up the minimum wage because there's like search frictions are lower and you find jobs more quickly. I think then transitioning to a new minimum wage regime could be faster than in Germany, and workers are probably more mobile in the US, and it's easier for them to relocate.
That's the history in the US. I'm not so sure how true that is anymore, but probably more so than Germany, certainly than in the UK. So, okay, Andrea, you're working on something which is really hot, at least in a different thing. There's a huge amount of interest in employer agreements, informal, to make life miserable for workers. Okay, they know. I mean, the general term is monopsony, but it's really all kinds of non-compete agreements, blah, blah, blah. And it's basically measures of concentration. What do these imply about non-wage benefits, about various kinds of aspects of the job that you've been talking about?
This is actually a very interesting question in the sense that what we see is that in principle, workers value non-wage attributes, and so they are ready to trade off wages for non-wage attributes. So if these non-wage attributes are expensive, we expect that under monopsony, employers will provide less of them. Now, in our work, we have looked at job security that we measure in two ways, which is very European-centric, so probably for the US are less interesting, because we measure that with the probability of being hired on a permanent contract and with the probability of being converted within 1 year into a permanent contract if hired on a temporary contract. Now, why do we do so? The reason is that first we have the data for that, and second, because what we observe in European countries, at least, is that the expected cost of job loss is higher in the case of temporary contracts, in the sense that the probability of losing their job involuntarily is higher. Of course, it's also higher the probability of finding another job of the same level after a short period. But if you compound the two, it remains that the expected cost of in expected terms, the cost of job loss is higher for temporary workers. So these jobs are more insecure. What we observe is that we have 5 countries for which we have data, and we observe that indeed the concentration reduces the probability of being hired on a permanent contract. And second, for the 2 countries for which we have data on contracts, we also observe that the probability of conversion is reduced. Now, this means that we only focus on wages, as all the literature has done. In fact, we are leaving aside part of the cost for workers. So we are underestimating in practice the cost for the workers.
In other words, things are worse for workers because the employers are more getting together than in fact we observe if we just look at wages. I wonder if this would be true for other characteristics like, well, not pension in Europe, but things like the safety on the job, for example. Presumably it's the same thing, you'd think, right?
I presume it's the same thing. I haven't seen, we actually had a project on that, but actually failed because we didn't manage to obtain data that are sufficiently exhaustive to be able to really look at this issue. There is some work in the United States. There are at least a couple of papers looking at coverage for employer-sponsored health insurance. And indeed, they find a negative relationship between concentration and employer-sponsored health insurance. I'm not aware.
I would bet the injury thing would work real well in that regard, too. And that's something, even though deaths on the job are very low these days, we're very worried about injuries here, which in a time of low unemployment tend to be much higher than at other times. And I wonder if that's especially bad in the more concentrated sector.
It's possible, but we need to take into account that there are now a number of papers showing that if employers have a lot of capacity of putting pressure for small accidents, probably they will be underreported because of the fear of the employer itself. So, right. And if you close it with our story about job security, suppose that this is a general effect. If you are worried about your job, perhaps you won't report. So it actually would be interesting to have a large set of data and look at very bad accidents and death, because that's cannot be underreported.
That's your next report, your next research.
Yes.
Perhaps. Okay, good. Let me go on and ask, since I'm very interested in hours of work, and I think a lot of people are, especially in the US, which is the world champion of work hours among rich countries, sadly enough. Michael Burda is one of the leading European labor and macroeconomists. He and I and Tito Boeri were involved in the project, the subtitle of which was, "Are Europeans lazy or Americans crazy in terms of hours of work?" What's the answer? Are Europeans lazy or Americans crazy? And you're all Europeans, and I won't be insulted whatever you say. Moritz, do you want to start?
So yeah, sure. I mean,
don't equivocate. I don't want an economist.
I wouldn't say you're crazy, but from my time that I spend across the pond, I would let me rephrase it. I could hypothesize that maybe you're caught in some kind of rat race. I think our institutions are a bit more, they protect workers a bit more from like this mechanism of, hey, if I don't work more, then my colleagues will, and so I'm not going to go on vacation. And so in a sense, like we have longer vacations, right? We have these restrictions on hours in European countries, but I think it's kind of interesting now that labor supply is kind of dropping in the US, and with this kind of collective thing of the pandemic, and maybe that's kind of like a moment for pause for some people to kind of like a wake-up call to think about, okay, how much do I really want to work? But it's hard to break out of that if you don't do it collectively.
It's a wake-up call. The question is, will we all keep bringing, or are we going to go back to our own ways?
Yeah.
Andrea, what do you have to say about this?
So I very much agree with Moritz. I think if I can go back to my own research, I would like to point to one thing. We studied for the effect on wages for 4 countries that are very different European countries, from Denmark, flex security countries, to Portugal, which was used to be, at least in the past, considered as the most rigid European labor market. And we find the same wage elasticities in all of these. And we also find that these are lower than what has been estimated in the United States. So what we could say is, why is the case? What's common of these countries? And what I would say, one thing that is common is sector-level collective bargaining. So what we observe is that all these countries have sector-level collective bargaining, which makes that wages are more difficult to adjust because are negotiated at the collective level. While we see differences as regard to the effect on job security, because that is typically not part of the negotiated collective bargaining agreement.
Okay.
Now, the point is that working time is part of the collective bargaining agreements. And
so what you're saying is that the US, because it's so fragmented, and this gets to Moritz's explanation, we basically can't get out in a competitive economy of what Moritz and what I've said is a low-level equilibrium trap. We're stuck down below and nobody can get out of it without losing money. That's very good. Daniele, what do you say about this?
I think that...
And Andrea didn't really answer my question, okay? You danced a little bit around it, and Moritz sort of answered, but Daniele, give me a straight answer, darn it all.
I don't think Europeans are lazy. Europeans are more concerned about the quality of life, if you want a sharp answer. The reason is that Europeans are more concerned about redistribution, and redistributing working hours is a concern of at least some European government. If you think about the limitation to temporary contract, the renewal of temporary contract, I mean, there is a focus on regulating the way in which workers are working. Think of the extreme case of the French law about reducing working hours, which was ineffective, but from a political point of view,
right,
it was a brave attempt, to rule the general economy amount of money, of hours which should be worked. And the European directive about the maximum number of worked hours in Europe is another evidence of that attempt. I mean, Europeans do consider the working hours as a matter of regulation, while I don't think it's the same case in US.
No, it certainly isn't the case in the US. I'll send you some work I'm doing on. My own personal feeling is I do think we are crazy in this country. And I say that as one of the craziest people in the country, but I don't know what to do about it. All right. I think one of you folks alluded to this possible shock because of the pandemic. How is that? Where are we going to be 10 years from now in all of your research and all of the things you all are looking at as a result of the pandemic? I mean, you guys are really all doing economic history at this point, one might say, in light of the pandemic. Is it still relevant? Daniele, what do you think? Is it all going to change because of this or not?
I think it's changing the top of the income distribution. I mean, anecdotal evidence tells me that firms are now offering packages of wages and amount of distance working. And which is not offered to the bottom of the distribution. So many commuting, high-level cadre commuting across cities do take advantage of this possibility, while it's not happening to the bottom. On the contrary, what is happening to the bottom, also because of the pandemic, has been a fragmentation. Think, for example, to restaurants, hotel, any kind of tourism. A country like Italy has lost something like 30% of the GDP in those sectors, and it has not been recovered after the COVID. And their work hours are something like 8-10 per week, nothing more. And
well, it's the same thing in the local economy here in Manhattan, which is heavily tourist dependent. I mean, we have this tremendous loss of jobs, and it hasn't affected the rich folks working in the financial district from their homes in Connecticut, by the way. But the average person looking for a job who lives in the Bronx and takes the subway down here. That's a very interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. Andrea, any thoughts on this one?
So, in my view, we shouldn't overestimate this structural change. In a sense, there will be a structural change. I think will be changing the activities into the economy. It will be painful transition for sure. But it's also, I mean, what we see is that also there is opening a number of jobs in what is called the green economy and so on. These are also manual jobs. And this is an acceleration of a trend which is going to stay, because I think the pandemic has changed the perception of the danger represented by, in general, environment unfriendly actions. And so also everything that has to do with climate change. You feel around that people worries about it. That's also the reason why there is less touring, right? The people worries about traveling. There are people that are refrained from traveling, in particular for traveling by plane. So tourism suffers because people don't move so much, but there will be a readjustment. So I think that's just an acceleration of a trend, but we will find it again. The other thing is teleworking. I would be less negative than Daniele. I think we see an explosion of teleworking in a number of occupations, and we see a number of jobs, a number of vacancies that are advertised as remote working only. So essentially, also because, of course, this is mainly white collar, clearly, but that's in many different type of occupation, not only at the top. And the reason is that employers are saving on office space. Yeah. And if I can say an anecdote that has to do with because often when I present my research on concentration, I come out with people saying, but this will reduce concentration because people can search for jobs everywhere, even from rural areas where there is more problem of concentration. But we have done a simulation at the OECD to try to see what would be the impact if all teleworkable occupation could become remote working, full remote working, and we obtain a very small reduction in average concentration. And this is for two reasons. First, because the big employers in local areas are also the big employers nationally. So even if you can apply for jobs everywhere in the country, that doesn't change necessarily completely. And the second is that these occupations turn out to be the least concentrated. So the two effects together end up to not to be dramatic. So at the end, I mean, there are things that are changing, but at the end, I think the rules of economics and the labor market won't change so much.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, hein?
Exactly.
Moritz, what do you think?
I think one aspect that's missing is that we think about differential impact that it has on men and women, and how, like, for young families, flexibility of work and working from home, how that's going to change stuff. I mean, Claudia Golden has been talking about flexibility requirements and that being the last chapter of the gender wage gap. But I think that I'm hopeful that makes it easier for families to, and especially women, to then kind of figure out their work-life balance and family work balance with these new possibilities of working from home and being a bit more flexible. But
that's sort of interesting. We've gone from Daniele, whose comments I took as being very depressing, that this is going to exacerbate inequality, to Andrea, who's kind of more neutral on this, to Moritz, who really sees a bright spot in this.
There is a perfect correlation with age. the speaker.
Well, I don't think the correlation, I don't think it's a linear relationship. I'm much older than Daniele by a lot, by a half a generation. And I'm very optimistic about this because, quite frankly, my feeling is any shakeup has the potential to do good, even something like this. Anyway, look, gentlemen, thank you very much for participating. Enjoy the rest of the conference. This has been a real pleasure. You all take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.